So Mayor Garcetti, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us.
Great to be with you, Duke. Thank you for having me in this beautiful and historic building.
We're delighted to be in this building. I think it's a testament to what ASU is all about. We care about cities and the buildings that are in them, especially this one, the former Herald Examiner building, so it's a delight to host you here.
A lot of stories broken in this building, so we'll break some more.
There are a lot of things been broken in this building if you look at some of the handrails and things.
Absolutely.
So it's November 15th.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we talk for just a minute? We are going to talk about the Tenant Cross project, but some elections have happened. Why don't you give us your sense of where we are as a country based on what's happened over the past week?
It's a great question, and I'm actually really optimistic coming out of these elections. I think it was a very forward-leaning election in a lot of ways. On one hand, you have, I think, Democrats and Republicans who haven't bought into kind of the Trump philosophy playing a lot of defense. Republicans wanting to redefine a saner Republican Party that stands for certain principles, but also abides by elections and reinforces some of the institutions that are bedrock. Democrats kind of, who are we? Do we have a message? Does anybody know what we've done? Can we stop the circular firing squad? And I think what came out of it was actually some common ground. I mean, I work in local government, so it's all about trying to find common ground. But I've been thinking a lot about that word recently, and whether it's common decency, common ground, common good. I think we've all felt like they've eroded and in some cases disappeared. And I think there were flashes of that really that came back in this election of some of the things that we hold together and the most important kind of principles. Shared government, which is tough. You know, one party you want to win. We're all about winning 100% one way or the other. But I think it's divided government in not a terrible way. It's not extremists. It's I'd rather have seen a few more Democrats win, but to have the Senate held, to have no clear majority in the House means compromise will have to be made within parties and between parties. And I think from the West in the 10, you saw really a push throughout that corridor of hopefully a little bit more sanity and a little bit more progressive leaning. I don't mean that ideologically, but progressive leaning to get stuff done.
Well, speaking of common ground, that's a useful jumping off point.
Yep.
So the thesis for Tenant Cross is that if you look at this geography from LA to Jacksonville, roughly following the I-10, we think you see the future of the country on the front lines of demographic change, front lines of economic change, front lines of climate change for sure. And there is a lot of commonality in terms of these issues. A lot of differences of opinion too. You've got the three largest states. They're obviously very different between California, Texas, and Florida. But nevertheless, we think if you look at this area, and particularly the cities, and I'm not sure we would be doing this project without Los Angeles, the second largest city in the country. We think keeping your eyes on this area is really crucial. So you're a student of cities. Tell me about cities relative to the country, which I think we were just doing. It would seem to me they're sort of the laboratories of democracy at the moment. And I think mayors play a special role in a lot of these issues. Talk about the relationship between cities and the country. They're often blue, sometimes find themselves in seas of red.
Yeah, that old saying that Brandeis said that states were the laboratories of democracy. I actually don't think that cities are the laboratories of democracy. I think we're the factories. Because laboratories are places you experiment. We actually churn out the products. So to me, this is a place where we practice it every single day. And while there certainly is innovation and there is a laboratory, we're R&D and production when it comes to how we live, how we tackle problems. I mean, think about the biggest challenge for the rest of our lives, climate crisis, climate change. There's one country in the world that is meeting or on track to meet its Paris climate commitments. That's Denmark. I chaired C40, which is a group of the 100 largest cities of the world, including many on the 10, from Miami to Phoenix, Houston. And we have 2/3 to 3/4 of our cities on track or ahead of schedule when it comes to enacting the really tough work. So we're actually churning out the solutions when it comes to zero emissions buildings, zero emissions transportation, zero emissions, electricity generation for those cities like this one that has its own utility. And I think that, whether it's great universities and universities used to be in the hinterlands and you'd go someplace where you could think and not be disturbed by the city. I went to school in New York, I went to Columbia, and part of the reason I went there was I wanted to be in the midst of a city because I think that thinking is even stronger and the relationship is stronger.
We're finding students looking for that today.
Yeah.
They do want to be in urban centers. They want to be close to maybe their future work, maybe that internship if you want to get technical about it. But yeah, they want to be in the life of the country or the life of the region. So yeah, they're gravitating, which is why we're doing what we're doing as a university and really setting up shop in cities. But you mentioned C40.
Yeah.
So as a mayor, you seem to have gone out of your way, I think it's just in your nature and your background and your inquisitiveness, to position Los Angeles in an international setting. You mentioned C40, there's climate mayors, there are other things that you participate in. In your visits to other places, I think you were in Buenos Aires only a few weeks ago, what have you learned as a mayor coming back to Los Angeles from the places you've seen, the people you've heard, the ideas that might have been presented to you?
I think the most commonly spoken language in the world is cities. It's not English or French or Mandarin or Arabic. You can put city dwellers in a room together, and certainly city leaders in a room together, and we're speaking each other's language. Like, oh, that's a cool bench. You did that with your curb? That's how you striped a lane? What's the building envelope? Oh, that's how you collect trash?
Wow, the designer planner's coming out in you very vividly right now.
Well, you can't serve in local government without looking at curbs for the rest of your life in a different way. And, I always joke that good mayors borrow and great mayors steal. There's this frictionlessness that happens between cities and between city leaders. During the pandemic, a good example of this was, it was my second Zoom call ever. I was like, what's Zoom? But we're on this weird thing called Zoom.
We all learned.
And I convened through the C40 network, those 100 city, 97 at the time, cities, mayors. I think we got maybe 70 plus. Wow. Which was miraculous given the time zones that we had to do. When we all were on that call at the beginning of this pandemic, the now late mayor of Seoul told us about what drive-through testing was, when people you can test people in cars. The mayor of Milan was saying, this is how you need to get the hallways of your hospitals ready so that fewer people are going to die, when it was peaking there. And the next day, we started to implement things in cities around the world. Mayor Khan of London, who succeeded me as C40 chair, told me the story of being with Boris Johnson, the late, great Boris Johnson. And they were in a meeting, and he was telling him about this call. And he said that Boris Johnson, who was prime minister at the time, turned to his cabinet members and said, do we know this information? And they said, yes, sir, we know this, but we're preparing a report. We'll get it to you, and then you can discuss it with other national leaders around the globe. And he said the difference between mayors is the next day we were doing it, if not the next hour, versus at the national, let alone international level. It takes weeks, months, sometimes years to implement. So I put a lot of great hope in that common language that is spoken by citizens, citizens around the world. And that same root of politics and city come from the same Greek word polis. And politics itself really comes from the idea of living in a city.
Well, I think it's been pointed out to me many times, mayors don't have the luxury of not doing, of not implementing. Their citizens are right there. Yeah. They meet them, they greet them, and they want to be responsive. Yeah. But at the same time, cities don't exist in a vacuum. And what, let's say, you here in Los Angeles and me in Phoenix have in common is that our surroundings are hugely important to us. And let's just take the obvious, water. Yeah. So the city of Los Angeles, the city of Phoenix would not be what they are without the movement of water from somewhere else to those cities to make them happen. So infrastructure is in the news a lot. I think Secretary Buttigieg is doing a fantastic job on a number of fronts. I think you would probably agree.
Absolutely.
But how do you think about the city in terms of its, let's call it fragility, or its sustainability in terms of infrastructure and what you need to make this city vital that comes from elsewhere?
Yeah. It's a great question for LA, because everybody knows LA because of movies. And some of the greatest movies like Chinatown are really about that initial infrastructure. People think we're a liberal city, but historically we've been more of a libertarian city. Steal me some water, build me some freeways, let the rest take care of itself. We'll just sprawl out, we'll let developers find new places, build homes cheaply, we'll get out there.
Sounds
don't worry
familiar.
about, yeah, exactly. Don't worry about the water, don't worry about the fires. We hit the wall with all that, so we're having to rethink it. But infrastructure for the next century has to be as ambitious in our thinking as it was for when the third largest infrastructure project ever built was taking all the water from Owens Valley, an aqueduct over a mountain.
I suspect you would say ambitious, but also smarter. It may not be brute force infrastructure at all times in the future, the way it was in the past.
Absolutely. Whereas in the past it was steal it, now it's conserve it, now it's recycle it, now it's rethink it. For instance, I'm not stressed about the water future here in LA. In the 9.5 years I've been mayor, we put forward what I think is the boldest kind of local Green New Deal, and it's not an abstract set of values and hopes of legislation. It's actually 460 plus to-dos, and one of them is to recycle 100% of our water. Today, 15% of our water comes locally from underneath the ground of LA. By the time we're done implementing this, 70% will. So we're gonna have plenty of water, even conservation, which infrastructure, we think of building stuff. How about just saving stuff, giving everybody a monitor so you can, on your phone, see when you have a leak in real time instead of a month and a half later when somebody says, why is it flooded in the front yard? And that can reduce 10% of our water use on average for $24 a person just getting this device. So, it, yes, has to be smarter, and I think it has to be more holistic too. We often thought of infrastructure in a vacuum. We're just doing water, we're just paving a street, we're just looking at technology, when we have to integrate these things if we're going to do it right.
But in terms of problem solving, and you, I think you were referring to some of the things you've been doing in the city, but you also casually mentioned other groups with whom you're connected to. We just had a podcast with Adele Hajkhalil recently. And so obviously the city of LA has to work with the Metropolitan, Southern California Metropolitan Water Authority and others. And he's working with other states to try to solve the water problem. But one thing he pointed out to us very specifically is we've got to save and reuse every drop. Maybe in every way that you can imagine. We no longer can be pushing it out to the ocean, and we got to think about every drop of water in whatever state it's in as potentially being potable and usable. And I know you're building things to accommodate that.
We had, a cabinet, an administration official came out here who's in charge of kind of Western water for the United States of America, and recent infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Act pieces of legislation. There's a lot of money for water. Some of that, Senator Sinema wanted to help farmers who are stressed on water. But I also said, make sure that money comes to us recycling 100% of LA's water.
Yes.
Because that's the smartest investment for Arizona. That's the smartest investment for Nevada. That's the smartest investment for Utah and Colorado. Because all of us that have to pull from the Colorado, and we were there first, so we were either smarter or just there. So everybody hates us, they resent us. Why should it be going farther away to Los Angeles? It's something that if we can get people to say, why are you giving money to LA? Giving money to LA liberates that water for the rest of its existence to the rest of the region. So we're trying to get a team mentality instead of just a competitive mentality, which is the mentality of the past.
Exactly. And another podcast I held recently was with the authors of a book called Mega Regions. And given your planning background, I'm sure you would appreciate this. The problems that we've got to address today, like water, just don't respect boundaries, and especially the ones that are artificially set up. And so to solve a regional water problem, and the Colorado is all that, do we have the right entities in place? We've got states, we've got cities, we've got counties, we've got certain authorities. Do we have the right system of governance, because I know you think about governance writ large, to solve these problems, which again don't respect boundaries? And I would throw heat in there. How do we think about that? Energy, certainly, and then water that we were just talking about.
Generally not. I mean, there are some legacy ones. I mean, we have joint governance in the region on water, but it gets tiered based on who was there first. So it's not, a lot of these things are historic rather than thoughtful for the present, their legacy.
Well, maybe if you thought about a different system, maybe you'd say that system that was legacy, as you described it, okay, I hate to say it, we have to scrap that and think holistically, as you just put it.
But the fear is, for those that are ahead, there's such a disincentive to do it that I think it really requires as much culture change as it does systems change.
Right.
When the mentality of, I work very closely with Greg Stanton when he was mayor, now Kate Gallego on water issues, because we know it's tied together. With the mayor of Las Vegas on transportation corridors. And if you think about whether it's economic success, whether it's migration, whether it's climate, water, heat, public safety, you can have good gun laws in one state. If it's next door, there's bad gun laws. You don't have border patrol between states, so guns will get there, as we see in places like Chicago and elsewhere. So it really does require, I think, a cultural change too among leaders. so much I've learned over 21 years is you can establish formal mechanisms, but the most important thing you can do is share power to become powerful. In the city of LA, for instance, we're one of 88 cities in the county. 4 million, next biggest is Long Beach, which is about a tenth that size, and then all the way down to cities of 120 people that are essentially industrial places with a city council. And yet I convened every quarter all 87 other mayors together, and we'd go to different cities for those meetings, give them the respect that they're due, build the regional team. And then when it came to things like large transportation initiatives, winning the Olympics, et cetera, we suddenly had goodwill. They're like, I might like the mayor, but I always hate the mayor of LA because he gets 100% of the headlines and he's only 40% of the population. And changing that for a region too, I think, is really important.
I think that's really smart. And in some ways, that's a microcosm of what we're trying to do with the 10 Across project, suggesting that over 2,400 square miles, 2,400 linear miles, we've all got something more in common than you might think. And yes, LA is the second largest city in the country and one of the largest on the 10, but there's Houston, there's Phoenix, there's people up and coming. And some of the things that we have in common are surprising. Around water, for example. The water issues in the Southwest are clearly about too little, but we're still talking about policy, infrastructure, funding, leadership in the Southeast, in the Gulf area. So pulling people together and seeing what we have in common, I think is a theme of your leadership, and that makes perfect sense. Let's talk about what's right outside our window here, which is downtown. And you talked about COVID and how mayors got together to address the issue. There's no doubt we're still in a recovery mode, and then that inspired all kinds of different ways to work, and sometimes not having to come downtown. And even if you do come downtown, it's more insignificant in terms of days of the week. So what do you think about downtowns and where they're going? I spent a fair amount of time in Denver, but Seattle, San Francisco, obviously Portland, they've got some challenges too. The future of downtowns, how do you see them?
We have strange downtowns in America because we had to grow much more quickly. Some cities are organic, but many of them are not truly organic in the sense of decades of kind of planning and people. They're less human-centered, they're more infrastructure-centered. If we just have a series of gerbil connections, whether it's, in Minneapolis because it's cold or here because nobody wanted to be on the street in the 80s. They're artificial and they're great probably in an architect's or engineer's studio. They're not as humanistic on the street. But there's underneath that, even here, like a very old LA that's beautiful along Broadway and it's kind of coming alive. But the challenge is, what do we do with all these spaces? I mean, to me, if we move from an agricultural to an industrial to an information economy, I recently was with a CEO of a big company who said, we're moving to the experiential economy. And so much of whether it's the workplace experience or whether it's just our leisure experience, increasingly as even more work will become automated, it's not even information, it's really the experience. And I think the winners of downtowns will make downtowns exciting, dynamic places, not just to come to for one-off events, but to stay in and to experience. And I think that's really promising and exciting, but it'll also require private landowners to be I think it's less of an issue for government, though we need to rezone, we need to allow adaptive reuse as we did here downtown. 20 years ago, which brought back a lot of downtown, and now with office buildings, I think we're going to need to. So there's some limited legislative work, but you also have to have landowners who are thinking about it in a very different way. And if not, if you're holding on for, I'm going to sell it one day for the price I had it 10 years ago when I thought this was going to be an office building or whatever, people are going to be sitting on vacant land, and you do see that in downtowns everywhere right now. I always say to landlords, look, waiting for the right tenant for even 2 or 3 months, the amount of money you lose on that, you can't make up for the next 2 or 3 years. So we should really be putting people in that ground level, giving opportunities for people to be creative in the upper levels, whether they want to live there and or work there. Retail is going to fundamentally stay shifted. So let's figure out, what does that street level experience feel like, and let people be creative. I'd rather be in LA than almost any other city on the face of the earth for urban creativity and urban entrepreneurs. But I think it's yet to be determined, and the winners will be places that people want to come to and stay in, both tourists and locals.
And you're suggesting a relationship between, yes, the private sector's got to step up and respond to this, but city government is not going to be passive.
Right.
It's going to suggest what it would like to see,
Yeah.
what we think the people would like to see, and what would happen here, and be making that case. I think you've done that frequently.
And look, there's still a ton of room for housing. I mean, to me, the
Sure.
solution is housing, 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 whether it's homelessness or whether it's middle class flight from Los Angeles.
Right.
You know, that really defines Los Angeles. Somebody asked me during this mayor's race, what are the top 3 issues? I'm like, they're very clear. It's housing, and it's housing.
Yes.
And LA, you know, the California dream, and we're a unique state in that. It's not that there aren't Arizona dreams or Missouri dreams, but the American dream and the California dream are in the lexicon because they're both so powerful.
Exactly.
We're predicated on good jobs, decent education, especially our public universities, our ability to have great weather, but also housing that was readily available and affordable. That last piece we've been failing for 20, 30 years. It'll take 10 to 20 to get out of it, and I think we've laid that foundation. But to me, everything rides on that, both for downtown and a city's health at large.
And we're about to have a 10 Across Summit in Houston, and we're going to focus on housing for specially invited guests. By the way, you're more than welcome. Maybe we could talk about this in early January. And we're going to have the authors of the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem.
Yes, it is.
Yes, of course, there are mental health issues affiliated with it and all kinds of other things, but ultimately it's about real estate and value and land costs and other things which make their way into these social and equity issues. Like homelessness. Let me ask you about another project which is in the news because you're a planner, thinker, designer, the LA River.
Yes.
So it was highlighted by our good friend Michael Kimmelman this past weekend in New York Times Magazine.
Beautiful piece.
And as he points out, and we have a comparable project in Phoenix with Rio Reimagine, it's become a representation of the city itself. It literally cuts through much of the city. And so different audiences, different communities, but people's hopes and dreams for a project like that begin to become almost cumbersome because everybody imagines it to be everything that they could want. How are you handling the LA River, and how do you see it as a vehicle moving forward? I know you won't be the mayor to oversee implementation, but how do you see something like the LA River?
Well, I used to walk the banks of the LA River with my dad in the San Fernando Valley where I grew up, and my sister, and he was an amateur photographer at the time. He's now a professional photographer, but he'd take pictures of us in this kind of strange river that was a flood basin, and we'd see nature and kind of feel like we were lost in the middle of a city. So I've always loved it, and my high school creative writing teacher was Lewis McAdams, who is kind of the poet of the river and founded Friends of the Los Angeles River. So when I was both council member of one of the main stretches, the Glendale Narrows, which is the one section that doesn't have a paved bottom, so you see nature, and then as mayor, put tremendous focus, including getting the Army Corps of Engineers to pass our master plan for the restoration of the ecology of the river, which now needs to be funded. If that was the big accomplishment I got for the river as mayor, the next mayor needs to be hustling. Now that they've funded some of the Everglades, which was just ahead of us in Florida, we now need to make sure that we get the money in place, because people forget how big LA is, how long that river is. This is like not even a banquet, it's like a giant restaurant. You're gonna eat it one bite at a time, but we've been eating a lot. We have strings of pocket parks. We've got the River Bikeway, which has been approved by voters through our local Measure M, and will get built out. We've got Frank Geary working in LA-owned Department of Water and Power land in Southgate with local officials and the Speaker of the State Assembly.
About that.
There's some real visionary work, and then of course at the end, where I think we forget, it's the LA River in Long Beach, where it finally turns in this beautiful area. LA and Long Beach have been working together, and the Olympics in 2028, it can really be like the gateway in. So, it is a very violent river. People forget that when they want to build on top of it. It killed a lot of people in the past. It has half of the fall of the Mississippi, which takes 2,000 miles to do it, in about 52 miles.
So the velocity of that water is, as you point out, deadly. The comparable project in Phoenix was inspired to some degree by the late John McCain to pick up what we had done in Tempe, Arizona, where we have a lake that's really our river, and expand that over 50 miles, like your project. It will have to be done in chunks, and our followers will have to find the resources to do that. But these projects are emblematic of the aspirations of citizens, and so I see that in the LA River. And you can even see how the 6th Avenue Viaduct has, I don't know if you could have imagined it attracting that kind of attention, both maybe the kind of attention you'd like to see and maybe some you wouldn't like to see, but it's astonishing how physical artifacts in cities represent the larger aspirations of a place.
Oh, the 6th Street Viaduct was, for me, LA at its very best. I mean, my whole family grew up in Boyle Heights on both sides, the Jewish and Mexican sides. My dad's he has a book coming out around Christmas time that is documenting the construction of the bridge, and he's going to give it as a gift to people in the neighborhood and the workers that worked on it. And when we had to make the decision, do we kind of go replacement or something bold? I said, go bold. Sometimes it costs a little bit more, but it's so worth it.
Right.
You shouldn't get your hair cut on the bridge or spin out, but I love that. I told people to relax. Everybody's like, is it a failure? I'm like, no. There's 1% of humanity are knuckleheads. You're going to see that when 100% of people are coming there. But it became a town square. It's become a symbol of our creativity and literally a physical link, as well as the beautiful design moment. It almost looks like Olympic rings in preparation for 2028. So to me, I think infrastructure, especially water, has this power. If you can canalize it, human beings love water. And if we can take the LA River, keep it safe, but also bring some fingers of it out into communities, that's really a legacy. And one of the biggest things that's happened while I've been mayor is we bought this huge chunk of land that's finally on the banks of the LA River. It was the last parcel left. And, we each do one thing. I bought the land, next mayor, develop the land. Mayor after that probably will get the credit for opening it up, but it could be a beautiful urban park for America right on the banks of this great river.
So in conclusion, because I'm sure folks here want to whisk you off to your next meeting, but you mentioned Boyle Heights and your history there. And we interviewed George Sanchez recently about his book, along with Jim Fallows. Boyle Heights is an example of this country compressed. Layer after layer after layer of history and different immigrants who've come there. And your own background is astonishingly complex and representative of Boyle Heights and beyond. It seems like you have exactly the right DNA for a place as diverse as this. But explain for maybe our viewers or listeners in the rest of the country, why a place like LA, or even more closely, Boyle Heights, is the best of the United States. The way that people have found their way into this country through a community that's really dense and isn't always been treated well. I mean, the highways, which we've looked at, have not been friendly to Boyle Heights, and the resultant pollution and other things that come with them. But tell us about a place like Boyle Heights and your background and why that prepared you to maybe be doing what you're doing now.
Well, I just got to warn you, we're going to need another 45 minutes because this is it's a long story and it's a great one, but I'll try to condense it. To me, Boyle Heights is everything in my family's story. So I have an Italian last name, but my father's side of the family is Mexican. My mother's side is Jewish from kind of the old Russian Empire. Today would be Poland and Ukraine and Belarus and Russia. Both sides found their way to Boyle Heights. My grandfather, interestingly, followed what is now the 10. He was born in Parral, a small town in the state of Chihuahua, where Pancho Villa was killed. My great-grandfather was killed in the revolution. His mother, who was full-blooded Tarahumara native Mexican, carried him over the border as a teenage mother, found her way to El Paso, came through Arizona, and eventually to here. He married my grandmother, who was born in Arizona, one of 18 children to 2 Mexican immigrants, again along the 10.
I was going to say, this is a really 10 across
story. We can tell, that's why I want to give 45 minutes just to this, but they found their way to Boyle Heights, which was interesting, a place of exclusion that became the place of inclusion.
Right.
And to me, that is the American story. Everybody didn't belong, whether it was a Puritan, whether it was somebody who was native here, who was attacked, or whether it was somebody brought in bondage from Africa. This was a place, by definition, of exclusion, that through our shared exclusion became, in many ways at our best, a model of inclusion. So Jews and Russians, Japanese, African Americans, and Mexicans who couldn't live elsewhere went to Boyle Heights.
Right. And
my grandfather had a home that was literally taken by the freeway. He moved my father, who was young, and his wife, and my aunt to another place that was taken for a second freeway by the Coliseum. That's another story of infrastructure.
Another very 10 across
cutting
story.
Us up. But Boyle Heights, I think, at its best, becomes a place where everybody can find their story. And because it's so close to downtown now, it also has the tension of what does it mean to belong. If I've been there for 3 generations and somebody's coming back who's white and Jewish, are they gentrifying? Or if they can trace back to 4 or 5 generations, is it return? Why aren't there many African Americans who live there anymore, and what can we do to build affordable housing so that people of color can be living there. We want good development, but we don't want bad development, but we don't want rents to go up.
Right.
We demand infrastructure like our train coming through Boyle Heights, but if that train results in further rents going up, we don't want it. It becomes very complicated.
Right.
But I think, kind of in conclusion, Boyle Heights for me is this prism which refracts our hopes, and at its best is a community of belonging, which I always think is more powerful than the word inclusion, because if I'm talking about inclusion, I'm more powerful than you and I'm including you.
Right.
But belonging, if we both belong, there's an equality to it. And I think when I see the beauty of Boyle Heights, it is about the inclusion. It was about the folks on the east side of the bridge saying, this is our bridge, the 6th Street Viaduct. We claim this as our own, not downtown coming to us, but vice versa.
It seems that this is the antidote to maybe what we're hearing on the national scene, which is challenged by ideas of, as you say, maybe not the wrong word, inclusion, but other kinds of understandings of difference. And Boyle Heights represents, again, as I said previously, I think the best of what we're capable of doing if left to our own devices to assimilate and be productive. So I think it's a great story, and it makes sense that that's your background given what you're doing. And you've mentioned the Olympics a couple times. I think it's going to be another chance for LA to tell its story. I know that's what you want to have happen. And
no, it's a point on the horizon really where we can, this town loves the Olympics, and we saw it 32 and 84. It always changed the games for the better. There's I think a vocal minority of folks who are like, Olympics sucks, and I probably agree with many of their criticisms about Olympics in general, which oftentimes comes at the expense of people when there's massive infrastructure built just to shuttle athletes. But what I would invite all Angelinos to be a part of is draw your city. Tell us who we want to be in 2028, and then take this canvas and paint it. We got $160 million before the game started to make sure that sports are inclusive in the city, so that Black and brown kids know how to swim, so they don't die at disproportionate rates, so that kids with disabilities can have para-athletic opportunities. And I really think 2028 will unite the city again, reintroduce us to the world, and we should all own what that narrative looks like.
Well, I think the complexities of LA make the story hard to tell for others who don't spend time in it like you do, but I think it needs to be done. The Olympics sounds like it would be a great catalyst for that.
Absolutely.
Mayor, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure. Here's to prosperity along the 10. One last 10 story, and I know I gotta go, but I just want to throw this in. During the pandemic, when everybody couldn't find masks to wear, and they were trying to buy them in China and other places for $5, $6 a pop, and they was looked as a good price. The head of our port, Gene Sirocco, became our chief logistics officer. We dealt with the thousands of people who said, I got a mask to sell you. Where we found them was at Honeywell in Arizona, down the 10, at 75 cents a mask. And at that life or death moment, we actually realized how deeply linked we were. Not looking across an ocean, but looking down the highway and helping American jobs at the same time we saved American lives.
That's why those of us from ASU are sitting here in LA talking to you. We believe the same thing.
Boom.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been fantastic.
Thank you. You too.